Today in the EU, the EU's 8 flagship projects of common interest to boost defense.
Protéger l'Europe, c'est le devoir de l'Europe. Alors, je pense qu'il est temps.
Protecting Europe is Europe's duty. That's why I think it's about time we built a European Defence Union, said Ursula von der Leyen. The EU is poised to launch a series of ambitious defence initiatives under the European Defence Industry Programme to bolster its military capabilities over the next decade. The European Commission has identified 8 flagship projects spanning land, air, maritime, space and cyber defence, which could be supported by a €500 billion budget. These projects aim to enhance EU-wide security and foster greater cooperation between member states, though crucial details regarding funding and execution are still under negotiation. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiorri and this is Today in the EU. To look into the specifics of this story, I spoke with our defense editor, Aurélie Pugnet. Aurélie, the discussions about defense have become a weekly practice now. So
yeah, I'm here every week. I hope you're happy
back.
to listen to me again talking about defense.
We're back in the studio. And last week we spoke about the plans the new commissioner has when it comes to European defense. And it looks like the EU is really gearing up its plans on this. What are the projects of common interest in EU defense and how could they transform European defense capabilities?
So we're talking about the projects of common interest in the field of defense. They are large programs that would benefit all the countries, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
And those, if we believe the current draft of the proposal, could be 100% funded with EU money when it comes to procurement and production. What could they be? That's the big question. It's all nice and pretty to say, well, we're going to create those projects, but what kind of projects are we talking about? Are we talking about munition? Are we talking about satellites? That's the question. Mm-hmm. And what the Commission did is that they came up with ideas as to, okay, what is needed by pretty much everyone and what the EU could actually invest. And they came up with a list of 8 projects, which they call flagship defense projects. And these include, for example, the very now famous air defense shield. What is an air defense shield? We imagine that it's a whole package of maybe satellites, of radars, of defense systems that would protect the entire continent. And those projects, the Commission said, okay, we're going to list them all, and more or less these could benefit from a fund which is 500 billion for the next decade. It's obviously a lot more expensive than this, but the EU can't fund everything because, first of all, 500 billion is already a lot, so let's see if the member states ever agree to that. But also, the EU wouldn't fund everything out of them. So we're talking about large projects that could completely change the way the Europeans defend themselves, but these are not created yet. So we have a baseline list of things that could become those projects. It's a bit complicated.
But can you tell us a bit more about these 8 baseline projects that are proposed?
So there's 8 of them, and they cover all the fields of defense, we say. So that is land, maritime, space, cyber. There is, like I was saying, the air defense shield, there's the cyber shield as well. There's a maritime awareness domain, which means probably we assume the protection of undersea infrastructure, so like pipelines and cables. There's a space domain awareness, so figuring out what is in space, if there's a satellite coming at us, coming at another satellite that is European owned and in risk of collision, do we know it's coming? Can we avoid it? That kind of thing. There's stockpiles of munition and missiles. There's capabilities for anti-chemical radiological components and a lot of other things.
You also mentioned the budget of 500 billion euros. So how will this budget for defense be allocated over the next decade? And what role will it play in strengthening EU defense capabilities?
So we don't really know. Is the baseline answer I can give you. Because this number was communicated by Ursula von der Leyen to the leaders in the summer. What von der Leyen said, from what we understood, is there's a need for 500 billion for the next decade, and that will completely help us modernize armies and defense equipment that comes along. But von der Leyen didn't give a reason as to where this number came from and what it would be used for. And this is where the 8 defense projects come into play, because these could actually be the ones getting that money. So these could also be turned into the common interest projects that could also get that money. So it's still a bit unclear. It's very unclear, actually. But having those projects identified and this list actually made gives us a very general idea as to, okay, this is where the EU could actually try and have an impact with its next European defense program. And whether that is in research and development with a certain fund, whether it is in production with another fund, whether it is in motivating joint procurements for member states to buy together and buy in bulk, that is another fund maybe. Now, where the money comes from at the end of the day, well, we don't know. In which fund it is at the EU level and in the budget, it doesn't really matter for now. What is interesting is that those big projects actually have an impact that is not just on one country. And we hear a lot about how no country, and that is true, no country can really defend themselves by themselves. So they need allies and they need cooperation with the others. And if you need a huge project like the air shield that involves satellites and defense systems and maybe drones, I don't know, and you need this to cover the entire continent, then why not have all the countries on board? Because between Ireland and Greece, you need the same capabilities and the same cooperation. So you might as well put them all of them together.
Now, what criteria determine whether a project like the ones that you're describing to us qualifies for this funding?
So those big projects that have been identified so far, the big 8, let's call them, for them to become projects of common interests that could see their production and the joint procurement of them be 100% funded by the EU, this is still under discussion as to how they would be funded. And so what we know is that the projects of common interests, they need to be related to defense only. Whereas the big 8, they also involve maybe components that are not purely defense.
All European countries need to invest much more in defense capabilities and resilience so that Russia would not even dare to make the mistake to test our nerve. And we don't have the luxury also to wait for the next long-term budget. According to our calculations, at least 100 billion euros is required to remedy the existing urgent shortfalls. Issuing defense bonds probably would be an opportunity for fundraising at scale.
Noted Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michal on the 16th of October.
The example I took was the northeast borderline, because that is a project that was proposed by the Polish and the Balts a few months ago already. And they said that they wanted a defense line by the border. This has a security component to it, but not necessarily a defense component to it. So, I mean, I don't know what's in this project. It hasn't been publicly released exactly in details. But let's imagine that this project is actually about putting up border fences so that you can stop the coming of migrant that is instrumentalized by, let's say, Belarus or maybe Russia at the Finnish border. You could see that funded under an internal security fund, but not necessarily the defense fund. So not all the big 8 would be turned into common interest projects. Some parts of it maybe, but some parts of it maybe not. And that is for the member states to decide, and that is not yet happening.
Speaking of member states, how are they involved in the decision-making process and the process of finalizing the structure and funding criteria for these kind of projects?
So as it stands at the moment, there's a lot of negotiations on the defense program, which would be the permanent scheme to define, to modernize the EU defense industry and to boost the production. The member states are currently negotiating in it, and this is where we find the definition, or not actually a definition because there is no definition, but the criteria to define a common interest project. And in there, initially, the Commission had a little bit more power, where they were the ones identifying, with consultation of the member states, obviously, which the projects of common interest were. but the member states have just decided, or they just released a new compromise where they say, well, actually, we would prefer to keep our hands on it. And that just shows that when it comes to defense, at the end of the day, the member states want to remain as close to the decision-making process as they can. And so they would also be the ones, according to this compromise, which may change 15 times until it actually comes to the true legislation. For now, as it stands, the member states will be the ones in charge of the funding and in charge of implementation as well.
And now that we've broken down a little bit these projects, why are they so important for EU's defense policy?
They are important because there is no project of common interest in the field of defense at the moment. There are some in other sectors, and they're important because, and this is something that you hear both from the Commission and the member states, they're important because not only do they get a lot of funding, and so it's obviously a great incentive, it's also important because these are projects that can actually benefit every single member state. Mm-hmm. So when you talk from Helsinki to Lisbon to Malta, everyone needs to have some sort of benefit to it. Mm-hmm. And this is quite a huge change because until now, all the schemes and programs when it comes to EU defense policy, research, development, innovation, everything you want, or even joint procurement that we've seen doing in the past years, these have mostly benefited the bigger member states because the bigger member states have the industries. Mm-hmm. And so when you allocate money to the member states buying, or when you allocate money to the industry producing, or innovating, well, it's kind of always the same. It's French, the Germans, the Italians. And when we talk about also maybe more innovation, you'll hear more, yes, about like smaller companies in other smaller countries. But when you talk about production of ammunition, yes, you'll hear more about the Nordics maybe, or the Balts. But at the end of the day, it's kind of always the same member states. So in creating those big projects, the big projects of common interest, you will still have this tendency, which, yes, it will more or less be always the same companies producing and the same countries maybe doing joint procurement. But at the end of the day, the projects, once implemented and once into place, which may be in 40 years, and just so we're clear, this is not a short-term situation at all. This will actually benefit every single one. That is the idea at the end of the day.
Thank you, Aurélie.
Thank you, Evi.
I am Evi Kiorri, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sainz de Tejada, Charles Cohen, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.